Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined by the co-founder and coordinator of Put People First PA, Nijmie Dzurinko, discussing ground-level organizing in Pennsylvania against Medicaid cuts and mass hospital closures, and how the multi-state Nonviolent Medicaid Army is taking those efforts nationally. But first, these headlines. It's official. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is shutting down operations at the end of September. This was announced last week and bodes ill especially for NPR and PBS stations outside of major metropolitan areas, while NPR CEO Catherine Maher has explicitly stated that her intention is to support that national network. It's really hard to say exactly what impact this will have on public media in the United States in the long term. I cannot emphasize enough that the media system in this country badly needs a rethink. It's not just that public media is under threat due to budget cuts, it's that a consolidated corporate media system that is largely run by people who are indifferent at best to working people is the only thing there to take its place. This is the logical endgame of the decades-long strategy we often talk about here on this show. Meanwhile, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has been trying to jam through a highly partisan redistricting plan in the state, prompting Democratic lawmakers to leave the state in protest. While Abbott and his state attorney general, Ken Paxton, have been bloviating about punishing the lawmakers, these legislators themselves acknowledge that breaking quorum is only a tactic to delay the inevitable. Another response to Abbott's plan came from New York Governor Kathy Hochul and California Governor Gavin Newsom, who suggested that if Abbott wants to gerrymander Texas so severely, that they will gerrymander New York and California more aggressively in response. While I'm pleased to see a little more fight from state leaders, it's not hard to imagine the negative long-term consequences of this nuclear option arms race in our democracy. If we're going to take seriously the problem that people are losing trust in democratic systems, do we really think that making elections more rigged, regardless of who it's for, is going to do anything to solve that long-term issue? Look, I don't have the answers here personally, but I think that we've got to be thinking a little more creatively and more grassroots for the real solution to this problem. After all, the party in power gerrymandering themselves into continued power isn't exactly a new phenomenon. The missing element in this gubernatorial brinksmanship, of course, is organized people power. Speaking of which, I want to highlight an organizing win this week from Tucson, Arizona, where the city council voted unanimously to block the development of Amazon's Project Blue data center in their city. Public meetings on the project drew crowds of up to 1,000 people over the past few weeks who showed up to express their concerns and disapproval of the $3.6 billion project, which would consume more water in the first 2 phases of construction than nearly 7,000 homes do in a month, and this in an arid desert city. It is intended to store data owned by Amazon for ICE and so-called predictive policing efforts, which we know do jack shit. We love to see folks at the local level wake up to the fact that big tech and AI are not our friends. Tucson caught on to the predatory development of these centers for the fascist data hoarding and deadly pollution-spewing stains they are, and said, no thanks. I'm really hoping this trend catches on. Before today's interview, I want to take a moment to ask you to support Convergence during our annual summer fundraising drive. Reader and listener support is critical in a time when independent media is under existential threat. So if this podcast has, in fact, helped, consider what you can do to give back to make sure that we can keep making it. Anyone who starts an annual or monthly subscription, gives $25 or more, or upgrades their subscription will receive a special thank you gift. Head over to bit.ly/summerfunddrive, all one word, to make your contribution today. You'll also find that link in the show notes. As we all know, massive cuts to Medicaid are in the pipeline for states all across the country. On this show, we've highlighted state-by-state efforts to protect folks dependent on Medicaid who are fighting back. This week, I was joined by the co-founder and coordinator of Put People First PA, Nijmie Dzurinko, to talk about how this organization and others that she's involved with are fighting ongoing Medicaid cuts and hospital closures in Pennsylvania. We also want to just throw it out there that if you or somebody that you know is involved in this type of organizing in your own state or city, let us know and we might feature your story in a future episode. You can reach us at mailbag@convergencemag.com. Now here's my interview with Nijmie Dzurinko, which was recorded 2 weeks ago. Nijmie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Caden. I'm really happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about the campaign that you were working on. Who's in your coalition and what does the sort of political terrain look like in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so I'm a co-founder of Put People First PA. We're a statewide member-led, staff-free organization. We're 13 years old this year. And we're also one of the co-founders of what's called the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, which is now operating nationally. In terms of the political terrain in Pennsylvania, I always like to kind of back up and give my Keystone State pitch. Pennsylvania is called the Keystone State. The Keystone is the stone in architecture that kind of holds the structure together. And so we like to think about Pennsylvania as this state of 13 million people, but it's part of so many different regions in the country. It's actually right on the Mason-Dixon line. Mm-hmm. So the line that kind of officially separates the North from the South. It's part of the Northeast corridor. It's part of the Rust Belt. It's part of Appalachia. So we've actually got this incredible mix of all different kinds of regions and influences and people across our state. And Put People First PA is explicitly politically independent, which means we're independent of both parties. And we also focus on uniting across lines of division, including the urban-rural divide, the racial divide, and the party divide. And so to speak to this question of, our organizing drive around Medicaid, we call it the Medicaid Cutoffs Organizing Drive. We actually started this organizing drive in anticipation of the purge that happened under the last administration. So with the ending of pandemic protections, starting on April 1st of 2023, 25 million people were actually cut from Medicaid under the last administration. In Pennsylvania, we had over 600,000 people cut from Medicaid, about half of them actually for procedural or paperwork reasons, the other half because of income fluctuations. So we've actually been in the thick of the cutoffs of Medicaid, people losing their health care now for several years. And so we are in a position to know that Medicaid cuts equals death. That's actually one of our slogans, Medicaid cuts equals death. And so we have been tracking and following what we call the big, beautiful bill for billionaires, which now has passed. Because that is, it's a big, beautiful bill if you're a billionaire, right? Right. That much is true. We just have to add that part onto the end. And so this organizing drive is a way of, one, directly organizing people who are on or unfairly excluded from Medicaid. Put People First PA is the only organization in Pennsylvania led by people on or unfairly excluded from Medicaid. And the Nonviolent Medicaid Army nationally is the only national network that is led explicitly by people who are on or excluded from Medicaid. And so this organizing drive has been holding kind of base building tactics like free people's clinics throughout our states. It's also been educating folks on our rights. So everyone who gets cut from Medicaid has the legal right to an appeal. And we've been raising consciousness about that, but also using Medicaid appeals as an organizing tactic. And like in Pennsylvania, we had a 93% success rate with the appeals that we collectively filed. So when people came to us and said, hey, I've gotten cut off of my Medicaid, filing those appeals as an organizing tactic, we had a 93% success rate in keeping people on their health care, which we feel really proud about. And we're going to continue to do that through what's coming. And I think, in the wake of what just passed at the federal level, we've then been taking up this issue at the states, right, to push back against the implementation of draconian measures, at the state level. But we also have been tracking the fact that most governors, be they Republican or Democratic, are clearly stating that they are not going to backfill the funding for Medicaid from state budgets. And so this is truly a massive crisis, just as the great Medicaid purge under President Biden also was.
No, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people are probably like the Medicaid cuts under Biden are not super top of mind to people, but it does bring to mind the way that in a lot of ways the pandemic opened this door to be like, how could things be different if we actually had the political will to make it so? And in a lot of ways, it feels like what we're living through now is still this sort of like long pandemic hangover in terms of like even the backlash, right, against Biden is like very much part of that big pandemic hangover.
I would agree.
Yeah, and I'm curious how the pandemic changed y'all's work, to be honest, like in that slightly longer term view.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your last point, Kate, and I wanted to make that point that I feel like and I think our collective analysis in Put People First, the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, is that part of what got us here today to the current administration that we have was this rollback of all of this, actual attempts to meet human needs, right, in the context of this pandemic, that then were taken away. And so I think for politicians and folks in Congress and even Democrats, right, who campaign on universal health care and who campaign on Medicaid expansion, what we saw during that era of those pandemic protections, which was short-lived, was that the Medicaid rolls swelled to over 90 million people in this country. And that is a move toward universal healthcare, right? That is an expansion of Medicaid, actually, right? That is actually moving us more toward the kind of society that we want to have. But then it was stripped away, right? And that was a bipartisan decision that was signed by President Biden in the omnibus bill that was signed in December of 2022. And then those cuts went into effect on April 1st of 2023. And so I think that's a really important context, to have. And again, right, the numbers that we've looked at in Pennsylvania that come directly from the Department of Human Services website, because they've been tracking, they tracked the so-called unwinding, which we call the Medicaid purge. And that showed that in just 1 year, a little over 600,000 people lost their Medicaid in Pennsylvania. And that's a similar number to what is projected to happen under the big, beautiful bill for billionaires over the next 10 years, a very similar number of 600,000. In terms of how the pandemic changed our work, well, we've been statewide for the entire existence. And so that's kind of, in some ways, that forced us to get familiar with things like Zoom and familiar with sort of remote meetings and organizing. We did a lot more in person, of course, before the pandemic, but we were in a pretty good position to move some of our things online during the course of the pandemic. We also have a really robust system of community care within the organization and what we call projects of survival. And so we were in a position to kind of support leaders through some of the crises of that period. So I think, we were impacted by it, as was everyone. But I think in some ways we've been able to weather those conditions in a pretty good way and actually continue to grow throughout the pandemic. So we didn't experience sort of a contraction in our membership. We actually really experienced a growth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that the something like a pandemic would be the kind of crisis that contains a lot of opportunity for an organization like yours. You mentioned, this thing that we're hearing from a lot of states, that a lot of governors are like, no, we're not going to backfill the cuts. So clearly a lot of the sort of like executive branch in the states are not our friends. Are there political allies that you all have been finding, and have you been able to like build with decision makers at other levels who are willing and excited to fight for Medicaid?
So I think we've found an entry point into this conversation specifically around the question of hospital closures. We have an epidemic of hospital closures in Pennsylvania that's been ongoing. It's not new. I think this is also, shared across the country. I think something like 22 hospitals have closed in Pennsylvania in the last 5 years alone. And I think that if people, if your listeners and your viewers look into the record in their states, may also see that there's a lot of hospital closure activity. And so this is, for us, a symptom of the fact that Wall Street is really in charge of our healthcare system. Private equity has an increasing role in our healthcare system. And profiteers, be they for-profit or nonprofit, go by the same logic, which is that if a hospital is not profitable enough, then it's going to get shut down. And our hospitals are being treated like a McDonald's franchise or a GameStop or, another sort of asset. And we find that is completely incompatible with our human right to healthcare. But the reality across Pennsylvania is that in all kinds of districts, be they urban, rural, suburban, or small town, hospitals are threatened with closure. And that's something that local officials, state representatives and state senators and the governor's office are starting to take a lot more seriously, because it is, a clear expression of this crisis. And so we've absolutely been connecting with legislators across party lines around what is happening with our hospitals, which is very connected to what's going on at the federal level. And as I said, has already been a serious issue even before this big, beautiful bill for billionaires.
Yeah, that resonates because I feel like, even here in California, like it's both the consolidation of hospital systems, right, under like just a few major operators, plus the fact that especially in rural areas, there's like not the money to keep these things open in the eyes of the people who are in charge. And I do think that like, yeah, comparing it to like how do we franchise like a fast food joint, or honestly even scarier, like turn it into sort of like an unsecured speculative like financial instrument, not more than just sort of something that operates in the sort of like quote unquote regular economy of goods and services, like that it's financialized is even scarier, I think. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm, I think that like it sounds to me like there's a deep strategy in looking at hospital closures as like a material representation of harm, and that touches people who are not just folks who are on Medicaid. That like this has consequences for folks who have private health insurance. And that feels like a really important piece of the power analysis here. Could you talk a little bit to that and how you've been able to find and build alliances beyond your base?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I just want to say is that our base is, in terms of folks who are on or excluded from Medicaid, I'm also part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And one of the great things about that campaign is that we put on the map the concept that there's 140 million people in this country who are poor or near poor, meaning that they're either living in poverty now or they're one paycheck, one healthcare crisis, one housing crisis, one climate crisis away from poverty. And that figure of 140 million is pretty much half the country.
Yeah.
And so I think it's out there now. It's no longer kind of looked at as this marginal group of people, or, it's just some sort of accident, because we've got to continue to lift up, right? That there's really no wealth without extreme poverty. And so the extreme accumulation of wealth that we see on one side of the scale is accompanied by mass poverty on the other side. And similarly, in Pennsylvania, there's more than 3 million people who are on Medicaid, and then many millions more who are just a little bit away or unfairly excluded because of other reasons, their documentation status or other things. So I think we already have an extremely large base, right, that we're seeking to move. And those folks, those of us who are on or excluded from Medicaid, come from every county in the 67 counties in this state, every political persuasion, every party, every background and all of that. But I think absolutely we unite with all of those. And this is something that we talk about. We really unite with all of those whose families have been harmed or killed by the healthcare system, which is practically everyone has a horror story about the healthcare system in some way or another. Even, as you said, people who have good insurance, even people who are insured through their union job, even people who are on the private market or have ACA plans, like everybody has an experience. And, it's one of the leading, if not the leading cause of bankruptcy in this nation, which shows a lot about, those are the folks that are going bankrupt are the folks who are paying for healthcare. And so, that's a large section of people too. And so we absolutely work across folks who are on or excluded from Medicaid, folks who've just been impacted by the system, as well as healthcare workers as well, right? A lot of healthcare workers who are on the front lines and see every day how much time they spend just dealing with administration and paperwork when they really want to be providing care, and also how they're caught in the middle of denials and, having to tell people that they cannot be cared for, which is a huge moral injury to millions of healthcare workers across this country.
No, that's definitely like when I think about what the folks that I know who are, I have friends who are nurses, I have friends who are nurse practitioners or doctors that like, or physician's assistants, like the kinds of things that they have to deal with because of this like accelerating crisis is really, it's not what they got into the profession for sure. Could you tell me a little bit about the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, how that formation came together, and what states are you all operating in?
Yeah, so it started here in Pennsylvania. It actually started after a 2-year struggle that we had with the Pennsylvania Insurance Department, where we did get some concessions. We found out that, they didn't hold public hearings on rising insurance rates. They just kind of did it behind closed doors. And so in 2016 and 2017, actually during the first Trump administration, we waged a campaign to get the Pennsylvania Insurance Department to hold public hearings on rising insurance rates. And we won that campaign in 2016. They held the first ever public hearing on rising insurance rates. It was a huge organizing opportunity, right? We always say that everything we do to develop leaders. So we're not simply going for these kind of like on paper wins that we just check off. We're actually doing it to really build our base and develop our leaders. And we definitely did it that year through that process. But we also inoculated our people. This is a term we use in organizing, right? To kind of prepare people and understand this is really what we're up against, right? And so here's what we can expect. We knew that by doing what we did just because we got a public hearing, it wasn't going to mean that they actually reined in the insurance companies, because in the end, the insurance department, after empathizing with our stories and telling us how much they appreciated all of our sharing for 3 hours of testimony, they then gave the insurance companies higher increases than they had even asked for. They gave them an average of 32.5% rate increases. And we learned through that process, it's pretty shocking. We learned through that process that the insurance department is actually charged. They're a state agency, but they're actually charged with helping make sure that the insurance companies stay in business. And so that is actually part of their charter. That's actually part of their job responsibility. So then the next year, we actually got them to do town halls across the state. We built new healthcare rights committees out of that process. But we learned through that, hey, the insurance department's really not on our side. Mm-hmm. We started developing a vision for a public healthcare advocate out of that. But we also decided to really pivot and think about how we really focus in on our base when we talk about directly impacted people, right? And the sort of leading social force, the group of people who have the most to gain and the least to lose from a fundamental transformation of society. We really decided to hone in on folks who are on or excluded from Medicaid, because the folks who were impacted by those rate hikes, that was something like 500,000 people. But the people who are impacted by what happens with Medicaid, as I said, is over 3 million people. Mm-hmm. And so the language of the Nonviolent Medicaid Army comes from Dr. King, MLK's call at the end of his life to build a nonviolent army of the poor. That's what he was talking about in the context of the first Poor People's Campaign. And so for us, it was like, oh, the nonviolent army of the poor, that's the nonviolent Medicaid Army, right? Because folks who are on or excluded from Medicaid, that is the nonviolent army of the poor. That is the 140 million people that we talk about in the Poor People's Campaign. So we started that here, coming out of that 2-year struggle, and we decided to make this pivot in 2018. And then in 2020, our mentors and some people around us were kind of like, you got to take this thing national, right? Like, you got to take this thing outside of PA. And so we basically put out a call and said, hey, we're bringing this nonviolent Medicaid Army formation, and we want to invite people to take this up, right? Which means focusing in your state on organizing people who are on or excluded from Medicaid, using healthcare as a strategy to unite people across lines of division, organizing statewide across that urban-rural divide in particular, right? Mm-hmm. And organizing from a lens of political independence, which again, it doesn't mean that we don't engage politically and hold all power holders accountable. It just means that we don't take our marching orders from the parties of Wall Street. And so in that time, people gravitated toward us. We had our first National Week of Action in 2020. And it's grown from there. It's really been a beautiful process, ups and downs, of course, right? It's not linear. It's all kinds of different things, but it's been growing and developing as a national formation. Some of the states who are in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, I'm going to try to rattle them off from the top of my head: Georgia, Texas, Ohio, Indiana, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Massachusetts, New York. We've had North Carolina, Illinois, and then there's a few other states that are just kind of starting to get organized with us. There's some folks in Arizona, there's some folks in Connecticut, and some other states. But there's about 12 states that have been pretty active in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like that's quite a broad range of sort of in-state political terrain too, which is really interesting, because I think that one thing I've been thinking about a lot about on the show is the ways in which different states' political terrain create opportunities to fight back against authoritarianism in different ways, and the knowledge that people have. I'm curious if that variety of states has really allowed you all to deepen your political analysis and develop new strategies, because just being able to share information about what's going on seems huge.
Absolutely, Kate. And I think that's a great point. And I think just like in our states, when we're base building with new people and we talk about, hey, like, your problem is not just your individual problem, it's shared by millions. And we coordinate across the state, because even within states, as we know, folks can be so isolated, right, in one place and kind of not know what's real out there, what's really going on. I think the same thing is absolutely true across the country. And it's absolutely a core focus of ours and a strength that, we do share that information. We have a national call the fourth Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. So we have one coming up this week. We have a monthly Saturday school. So we're sort of constantly, comparing notes, looking at the terrain. We actually do a landscape assessment in every state. And so we actually help every state to sort of get an assessment of their landscape, specifically using the lens of the healthcare crisis. But the reality is that the healthcare crisis is at the, it's an interconnected point of everything, right? It's an interconnected point with climate change and public health, with mass incarceration, with jobs, living wages. There's nothing that doesn't connect to healthcare in some way. And so, we do a landscape assessment. We talk about the conditions going on in our states. And we also really try to support and help each other to, learn from each other, learn from the history of our organizations and groups, and make new mistakes, right? We're always talking about that. Like, let's make new mistakes. Let's not make the same mistakes. So we really try to live into this network form of organizing.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and like extremely heartening to hear that. Like, yeah, I feel like the emphasis on making new mistakes feels really big to me in this time, that like we all need to lead into making some new mistakes these days. So if folks want to learn more about your work, if they want to maybe plug into networks in the States or learn more about the Nonviolent Medicaid Army in general, where would you point people? How can people plug in?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for asking. So we have a website, nonviolentmedicaidarmy.org. And one of the things on that website, there's a link when you go there that's called Medicaid Mondays. And that's actually a story sharing campaign that we have as part of this Medicaid Cutoffs organizing drive. We draw on the history of like the abolitionist movement, right? And the vigilance committees, and how coming into the movement, one of the first things you would do is tell your story. And so we draw on that, and we have that. And so invite people to take part in that. We're also on Facebook, Nonviolent Medicaid Army. We're on TikTok, Nonviolent Medicaid Army, and Instagram. So that's a great way to kind of, following us on social media is a great way to just kind of stay up to date on different things that are happening. And then you can also send an email to nonviolentmedicaidarmy@gmail.com if you're just interested in saying, hey, is the NVMA in my state, or how can I get organized, or how can I get involved? And when you follow the social media, you'll also see the announcements for the national call, which is always the fourth Thursday, and it's open. It's an open call for anyone to get involved, and our Saturday schools, which are generally on the first Saturday of the month. And that's a political education and organizing and coordination space as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you think that our listeners should know about the work that you're all doing, things that you're learning through these campaigns?
I think that there's just a really important period, right, of organizing here. I don't want to call it a moment, I think it's a period. And I think we've got to know, where we came from. How did we get here? What is the context for what we're experiencing now? And then we've got to, I think, really see the potential and power in organizing, right? We talk about building permanently organized communities. And I think mobilizations are very important, but organizing is incredibly important and essential. And so I just think that we all need to think about and consider the importance of organization that is statewide, that is crossing that those geographical divides, and is connecting with people on the basis of where we're hurting, and then bringing people into a long-term process of leadership development and political education that helps and enables us to build more leaders who really can wield strategy and tactics, not just show up, hold signs, tell stories, but maneuver on a very, very complicated terrain. And we need many, many leaders in order to do that. And I think we have figured out something about that, the Nonviolent Medicaid Army. I'm really proud of it. And we're definitely looking to connect up, with others who are interested in these questions as well.
Amazing. Well, Nijmie, thank you so much for making the time to talk with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure and really interesting work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caden, and thanks to your whole team. Really appreciate you all.
My thanks again to Nijmie for making time to join me. You can find ways to connect with their work in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. If you have something to say, please drop me. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And finally, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure that our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.